going on, guys? It's your boy. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. Potentially the last movie in the Mission Impossible franchise. We'll have to see for that one. But I personally really enjoyed this movie. There was a lot to enjoy about it. There's a couple of flaws here and there that I do want to talk about. Let's dive into this, shall we?
Modern Movie Review.
Okay, so before I get too far into this video, I'm going to go ahead and give my spoiler-free thoughts because a lot of my biggest issues that I have with this movie, I feel like I do need to talk about spoilers a little bit. So overall, I'm going to give a spoiler-free review right here. Overall, this movie has the action, the intensity, the stunts that you've come to expect for Mission Impossible. I think that it is all jammed-packed into the last hour of this film, and it is a very exciting third act. I think that the third act of this movie is, from start to finish, absolutely perfect. I think that it is incredibly well paced. I think that like I said, action sequences are incredible. The stunt work is fantastic. You've seen the stuff with the plane, and the stuff that they show you in the trailer is so minuscule when it comes to everything that he is doing on that plane. It is absolutely incredible. There's some cool fight sequences that I couldn't even imagine how you would choreograph stuff like that. Like, it is so well done. There's a lot of tension between the American government, a really interesting moral question that kind of gets asked towards the end of this movie, and I really like the way that they handle it. Incredible performances by everybody, down from obviously the main cast like Haley Atwell, Tom Cruise, to even some of the minor roles like Hannah Waddingham is in this movie for maybe about like a minute, and she is perfect in this. And that's something that I really like about this movie from start to finish. Even the small actors who have like maybe one or two lines and are in this movie for maybe about 2 minutes have something to do, and they absolutely master the acting in this film. Everybody who is in this movie brought their A game, and it's very obvious on screen. I really like that. I think that for the most part, the acting is well done. The script, for the most part, I feel like is relatively solid, but the editing and some of the decisions that they decide to do in the first act of this movie does kind of bring it down a little bit. When I made my out-of-theater reaction for this movie, I said that I think this is one of the worst movies in the Mission Impossible franchise, and that's not to say this is a bad movie. That's to say that the Mission Impossible franchise is so incredible that this movie, despite being something that I would still rate like a 4.5 out of 10, it's not quite at the same level as movies like Mission Impossible Fallout and the first Mission Impossible movie, which still to this day holds up insanely well. I still like the movie. I just think that there are small little elements of it that are underwhelming. Like, before the title card, there's usually some big moments that they start off this movie with a punch, and in this film it doesn't quite live up to that. I think that it is one of the least interesting of the openings for any of these Mission Impossible movies. It feels really like they did a 20-minute long previously on section, and then they immediately get into like an hour of just more previously on stuff. The beginning of this movie is very much just exposition dump after exposition dump after flashback after here's some more random exposition, and they need to basically imagine you're making like a little like domino trail, and it's going to do something really cool, and it's going to make a fun little pattern. The first hour of this movie is them meticulously setting up those dominoes so we could watch them fall at the end of this movie. So it is necessary to an extent, but at the same time, when it comes to this movie was originally going to be a part 2, it doesn't feel like they trusted the audience to have watched that part 1. Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 is a great movie on its own. It stands alone relatively well. You don't necessarily need to watch this one. But that being said, there's a lot of storylines that they kind of set up that you would want to see paid off. And it takes the first hour of this movie to kind of like beat around the bushes, reintroduce certain characters, and really takes a long time to reestablish things that we should have already just gone straight to the point. I think that's one of my biggest gripes with this movie is, unlike movies like, you know, The Deathly Hallows Part 2, where it kicks off right into the action, or Dune Part 2 is a great example of this, where they just immediately get right into it because they trust that the audience saw the first part first. This movie doesn't do that, and I think that to an extent is one of the main gripes that I have with this movie, is it doesn't trust the audience a lot. There's multiple times where they're trying to establish the stakes of this film, and I swear to God, you hear somebody say to Ethan, the entire world is in your hands. Oh my God, if you don't do this, the entire world's going to be destroyed. Oh my God, we're all going to die. Oh my God, the world is at its end. There's only 3 days left until doomsday. And they are saying it, which I understand, right? If the world is actually ending, and we know for sure that the world is ending, and that's like a thing that is 100% set in stone, we know it's going to happen, people probably will not shut up about it. But when you're watching a movie, in the first hour of it, they feel the need to say, the world is going to end 17 times, it kind of loses its value a little bit. Like, I feel like there's a couple of moments, like the president having to tell him that in a very like heart-to-heart moment. That makes sense. We need that. That's a very powerful moment. That's one of the most powerful people in the world saying that the world is going to end, and it's definitely a thing that's happening. So we don't need all these little side characters also being like, hey, by the way, Ethan, the world is going to end. Yeah, he knows that. We know that. Stop telling us, show us. But that being said, just a little gripe. That was something that really bugged me a lot about this movie. And now, for one of the main things that bugged me about this movie, I am going to have to go ahead and issue a spoiler warning here. So those are all my initial thoughts and reactions. Like I said, this movie's still really good. There's just a lot of little nitpicky things that will absolutely bug me because, in my opinion, a lot of the other movies, there's nothing I could even really point out at them and be like, that was really bad. So for this movie, for there to be those little flaws scattered throughout, and the first act really is slow and 30 minutes of the runtime feels like it's flashbacks. So for me, it is really good. It ends incredibly well. The last hour makes everything in the beginning worth it. And I want to establish I do really enjoy this film. Alrighty, sorry for the awkward cut, but now to get into some of the spoiler stuff that I want to talk about. One of the first negatives that I want to talk about, there is a character death early on in the movie. It's Luther. It is a very emotional sequence. When we first re-meet him in this movie, he has some kind of like sickness or illness, and they're kind of like trying to treat him. And it's kind of already like a thing that they're like, he's overworking himself. He's going to end up dying. This whatever sickness he has, which they never clarify what it is. You just kind of like know he's in a hospital room. He has an IV machine, all that stuff. So you get this feeling that like, okay, this is the end days for him. He's going to potentially die in this movie. And because of that, for one, when he does die, it is pretty emotional. And I do think that like if I was older and I had seen all these movies like when they actually came out, I do think that would be insanely emotional because he is a character who's been in these movies for about 28 years or something like that. He's one of the few people who has been with Tom Cruise the entire time this franchise has been a thing. So it is a very emotional death sequence, and I do really like it. But the issues that I have with it are, for some reason, in the beginning of the movie, we get one sequence with that character, Benji, and Ethan Hunt all together in a room, and they're kind of talking about, you know, reliving the glory days, and oh my god, everything is going to work out, everything is going great. We get kind of a clue as to what Luther has been up to and how he's been working on something to destroy the entity, and that's basically all we know about like what they've been up to and stuff like that. But throughout the course of the first act, they're constantly like cutting back to like scenes with Ethan and Luther together in this hospital room where he's working on the thing. And it becomes a really weird thing where it's just like, oh my god, no, this really emotional sequence where Luther dies. And then 2 scenes later, we're having a scene with Ethan and Luther having a conversation so casually, so calm. Like that's not like we didn't just witness this character die. And I think that that's where one of my biggest gripes with this movie is. The editing is so weird, and the way that they decided to make so much of the stuff that happens in the first act not chronologically is something that absolutely kills me, because there's a lot of sequences after Luther's death sequence where Luther is just there and he's having a conversation with Tom Cruise about, you know, this death key and this plan, and oh my god, you're one of the greatest men I've ever worked with, it's been an honor and stuff like that. And it's like, this is really cool stuff, this is really emotional, this is pulling at the heartstrings, but also this should have been before he died. Because you're doing so much stuff. Like Luther did a lot that really helped him with this final mission that they're doing. And that's like a really big thing, is like, this is a team effort. We're all going to need to do our jobs perfectly 100%. This is really important for us. And Luther actually kind of was a big part of that team who does this final mission. And for some reason, they show all of his involvement and all of these things that he does after they killed him off. And it was just really weird to like keep revisiting the character in these weird flashback sequences. And then on top of that, with the flashback sequences, we're also seeing flashback sequences to like Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 and the original Mission Impossible movie. We see the sequence where he's stealing the thing from the CIA whenever they break into that warehouse. We see the scene with him dangling down by a wire probably about 5 times throughout the course of this movie, and I do like it. I think it's a really cool scene, and I like the fact that they brought back that guy who created that security system and show like, because they broke into that vault or whatever, he's been living off the grid essentially because the CIA was like, hey, you failed us, screw you, which I do think is great. That is something that I like about this movie. It does a lot of work throughout this film to kind of show that the American government kind of sucks, and they do. And I love that. I really appreciate the fact that like they do not try to glorify the American government in any way. They don't try to make it where it's like the American government is some of the best people to, you know, be interacting with. but I like that the president sometimes has to do questionable stuff. The people that she's surrounding herself with are people who are just like, sometimes violence is the answer, and they're all a bunch of people who do not have even a shred of empathy throughout this film. And I like that we're getting that, and that they're not trying to be like, no, we're heroes and we're going to do this noble thing. No, because that's not what the Americans would do. And so I like that. I thought that was like just like a small detail that was really important, and I appreciated that they did that. Another thing about this movie, though, to kind of try to get back on track with the actual like regular Mission Impossible stuff, the entire supporting cast is so good. Palm Clementif was absolutely phenomenal in this. When I saw her show up, I got insanely excited. I love the fact that her character is very like murder hungry, and there's a lot of situations where they need to fight people but not necessarily kill them, and she's just so excited to murder somebody, and they're like, no, maybe not right now. Maybe don't do that. And I think that that's very entertaining. Haley Atwell is just as charismatic as she was in the first movie. I think that the way that she steps into this role and being the newcomer who is very like, she cares a lot about Ethan Hunt. And I think that that's something that is really important. I think that she kind of grounds the story a little bit and is almost like the everyman of this story, which I do really appreciate. We also get Benji stepping into a leadership role, which is so good. I love in the third act, there's a sequence where like one character is having to like deal with the entity and doing like a hacking thing or whatever. One character is having to operate on him live because he's going to have a punctured lung. And then there's people outside in another room trying to defuse a bomb. And meanwhile, while he's like bleeding out and like it seems like he's going to die, he's giving all of them instructions from one to one to one, and it's so good. And probably my favorite sequence of this entire movie is when him and Ethan Hunt kind of have their like farewell goodbye moment where they're talking about things, and like Tom Cruise is like, I need to go after him, but I don't want to leave you guys here to, you know, have to figure things out on your own. And Benji just keeps saying, we'll figure it out. And then they're like, but what about this thing? And he's like, we'll figure it out. And then what happens with this thing? And then he's like, we'll figure it out. And then eventually, you know, Tom Cruise leaves and runs away. And then it gets revealed that Benji was shot and he's bleeding out. And he looks to Haley Atwell and he says, we'll figure it out. And it's so good. And I think that even though that is such like a tiny little like line of dialogue, it's incredible. It's a mindset that's phenomenal. And when it comes to spycraft, it's adapt and overcome. And that is exactly what these movies need to be. And it was perfect. I loved it. I think that the delivery of it was fantastic. And I think that that movie, in my opinion, sums up perfectly why this film was incredible and was a great way to end kind of this trilogy, with Benji being able to be a leader and it being like his team. And then just overall them all trusting each other perfectly and everybody doing their mission perfectly. And something that I like about this movie as well, other than Luther dying or whatever, nobody dies in the final sequence. Like during the final mission, nobody dies. And I think that would have been a very cheap way to try to make like a very like emotional thing late in the movie. And they didn't need to do that. And I loved that. I'm glad that they didn't feel like, okay, yeah, let's just kill off a character, because that's a great way to make people emotional. They were still able to get us emotionally invested without doing that. And I love that. I think that was awesome. Gabriel dying, incredibly satisfying. I loved that. And just overall, this was a phenomenal movie. I will say, there's one last thing that I want to talk about, and it's such a minor thing. So there's this like kind of like, I think he's like an English officer or something like that, but there's a guy who's constantly after Ethan, and they've been having a lot of arguments and stuff like that throughout at least the last movie. I can't remember if he was in any of them before that, but him and Ethan have been butting heads for a really long time. And at one point, Ethan lets him capture him or whatever, and they're having a conversation, and they kind of are like, hey, why do we hate each other? And then Ethan and him is like, hey, the entity wants us to hate each other. We should actually, you know, be friends and everything would be great. And then the guy's just like, we could be friends when this is all over. Or like, I'll respect you when this is all over, or something along those lines. And then when the mission is over and it's the last like 2 minutes of the movie or something like that, they are in a helicopter going to pick up Ethan where he parachuted out of his plane that was crashing. And they're meeting in a field. It's just him, Ethan, and then the guy from MI6 who's kind of like the man in charge of all of MI6. And the guy pulls a gun out, aims it directly at Ethan, and I thought we were about to get one of the greatest plot twists in the history of ever. Because could you imagine if they ended this movie by killing off Ethan Hunt? That would have been insane. It would have been cool. And I think that would have been a really great kind of twist reveal that like they wanted the entity to win. They wanted to take over the entity. They wanted it to be American property or something. And because Ethan had to go and be a good person and destroy the entity entirely, that was against the Americans' mission, so they killed him. I think that that would have been sick. I would have loved that to death. I think that that would have been, like, if that had happened, every complaint I had about this movie would have been gone. I would have said it's the greatest movie of all time, period, point blank. That being said, obviously you don't need to do that, and that kind of goes against what I was saying earlier, where it's like, you don't need to kill somebody, that'd be a cheap thing to do. But I think that killing off a titular character in any movie ever is like one of the boldest things you can do, and especially if you did it in a sense like that, where it's like, oh my god, he was just the hero, but now, surprise, because he went against his mission, which he always goes against his mission, he never follows orders, him being murdered at the end of it would have been a really interesting thing. And it would have been cool if they did it in a very unceremonious way, just somebody pulling out a gun and then everybody else just thinks that, you know, he died fighting Gabriel or something, and they have no idea that he got murdered because they wanted the entity. I thought that would have been a really sick twist. And like I said, I like it when the American government is kind of the bad guys. So the fact that, you know, the American government actually were all good people in this movie was okay. Like, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But that being said, if I had to give this movie a rating on a scale of 1 to 100, even though I don't think it lives up to some of the other Mission Impossible movies, that's just because all the Mission Impossible movies are like high 90s in my ratings. I'm going to give this movie a solid 89 out of 100. I think it's also incredible. I think that it is emotional when it needs to be emotional. It has great action sequences where it needs to have great action sequences. And if you take away the weird editing decisions and things not being in chronological order the first half of this movie, it works really well. So that being said, that was it for this video, guys. Thank you guys so much. If you liked it, feel free to like and subscribe, and feel free to let me know your thoughts on the movie down below. With that being said, I'm going to sign out. Peace out. Bow. Bow. Bow.